Then the French court was struck by another dramatic blow. On December 18, 1415, Louis the Dauphin suddenly died. He was 17 years old.
Rest in peace, my child. May God protect us. Protect the throne of France.
Louis was replaced by his 16-year-old brother Jean, but he would die just 2 years later. So the title passed to Charles and Isabeau's 14-year-old son, the future Charles VII. But the new Dauphin detested his mother. He was convinced she had deserted his father and taken many lovers. To defend his father's honor, he banished her from Paris. Furious, Queen Isabeau took refuge in Troyes in the Champagne region and switched allegiances. In November 1417, she asked John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, to join her.
Madam, it is an honor to serve you at last.
In less than 3 months, they formed a government to rival that of the Dauphin Charles. They took control of the administration and seized Mad King Charles's treasury. But John the Fearless wanted more. He wanted the capital. And he would get it. The Parisians, tired of the Armagnac's rule, let the Burgundian soldiers enter the city. Over several hours, the loyal supporters of Charles and the Dauphin Louis were slaughtered in the streets. Terrified, the Dauphin and his supporters ran, taking refuge in Bourges. July the 14th, 1418, the Duke of Burgundy and Queen Isabeau made a triumphant entry into Paris.
Finally, we shall govern this kingdom as it deserves. Greatness, madam. That is what is needed to save France.
I place my trust in you, my friend.
John the Fearless now controlled not only the Queen, but the King too. Contrary to what he believed, John the Fearless was not the only ruler of France. His influence only covered the north and the east of the kingdom. The country was divided and under several rulers. From his refuge in Bourges, the Dauphin Charles formed his government with the Armagnacs. This made him more powerful. He ruled in Anjou, Berry, Touraine, and all the way down to the south of France. But there was another king on French soil who still dreamed of wearing its crown. After Agincourt, Henry V had set out to conquer Normandy and laid siege to Rouen. Once the city fell into his grasp, he moved his troops on towards Paris. At all costs, John the Fearless wanted to stop Henry V's progress, even if it meant forming an allegiance with his bitter Armagnac enemy, the Dauphin Charles.
Royal Highness, it is time to forget our disagreements. The enemy approaches. We must unite our forces.
To discuss their allegiance, the Burgundians and the Dauphin decided to organize another meeting, a more official one. On September the 10th, 1419, John the Fearless met with Dauphin Charles and his Armagnac counselors at Montereau on the Yonne Bridge. Each was entitled to be accompanied by 10 men. But the negotiations were to be between just the two leaders.
Your Royal Highness, be assured of my gratitude.
Thank you, sir.
In fact, John the Fearless, had been set up. But this assassination was a big mistake that would have terrible consequences. When John the Fearless's son, Philip the Good, learned of his father's murder, he vowed to destroy the Dauphin and all the Armagnacs. To do that, in partnership with Queen Isabeau, Philip took advantage of the madness of King Charles and signed an alliance with the King of England. The Treaty of Troyes, signed May the 21st, 1420, nearly upset the history of Europe forever. In this copy of the treaty, in French, the King of England was named as the legitimate heir to the crown of France. And as for the so-called Dauphin, as it was written, he was excluded from the succession to the throne for his horrible crimes, in particular the murder of John the Fearless. For Henry V, this was a stunning victory. He had been handed France on a platter. In Bourges, the man everyone now called the so-called Dauphin learned that the Treaty of Troyes had precluded him forever from sitting on the throne of France.
Immoral traitors!
That was not all. He learned that his 19-year-old sister Catherine had married the King of England. The heir born to this union would unite the two great nations under a single crown. December 6th, 1421, 18 months after her wedding to King Henry V, Catherine went into labor. If it was a boy, he would be the future King of England and France. Henry, a future king, to join the great dynasties of Valois and Lancaster. But in the shadows, conspirators plotted to prevent the young Henry from ever wearing the French crown. Charles VI's throne was there for the taking. Aged 54, the Mad King was at death's door. He died October the 21st, 1422. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the crown of France should have passed to Henry V. But the English king had also died 7 weeks earlier. During the summer, Henry V, like many of his soldiers, had contracted dysentery during the campaign. He died in Vincennes on August the 31st, aged 34. So who was now the King of France? 9-month-old Henry of Lancaster? Or Charles de Valois, the so-called Dauphin? At Chinon, where he had settled with his court, Charles the Dauphin saw this chaos as an opportunity to recover his birthright and ascend the throne of France. On October the 30th, 1422, he proclaimed himself Charles VII, King of France, and renewed combat with his archenemy, the English. Now he had to convince the French people that he was the rightful king. He needed a sign that God was on his side. This divine sign would come in the form of a 17-year-old girl from Domremy in the northeast of France. From the age of 13, Joan claimed to hear the voices of saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. Their message was that she should go and find the Dauphin Charles and have him crowned at Reims. February the 22nd, 1429, Joan arrived at the royal court. Charles was intrigued by the young girl. He decided to test her powers. Joan had never seen Charles in person, so he hid among his courtiers. But the maid recognized him straight away.
Noble Dauphin, I was sent by the Kingdom of Heaven to drive the English out of France. They must go back to their own land, for the love of God, or they will have to answer to me.
Charles trusted Joan and gave her a mission to fulfill. Since the Treaty of Troyes, the English had held the north and Paris. Charles VII was master of the south of the realm. While in the north and the east, the young Duke of Burgundy played the arbiter. In spite of the death of Henry V, his army continued its pitiless march southwards to take the cities of Charles VII. But one city held firm: Orléans. Since September 1428, the English had laid siege to the city, and Charles VII was desperate it didn't fall into enemy hands. To stop the English siege of Orléans, Charles VII sent an army led by Joan and Gilles de Rais. In early May, Joan's army was at the gates of the city.
Onwards! For God and the Kingdom of France!
She urged the soldiers on and led a series of attacks against the English, who had seized the watchtowers on the outskirts of Orléans. For 8 days, the maid's tactic was simple: attack the enemy head-on. On Sunday, May 8th, the English were defeated and called off the siege of Orléans. Everyone called it a miracle.
Hail Mary, full of grace, our Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb.
The legend of Joan of Arc was born. News of Joan's victory spread like wildfire across the whole of France. English morale plummeted. Charles VII and his supporters were now convinced that Joan was invincible and that, thanks to her, God was at last on their side. As the maid prophesied, on July the 17th, 1429, Charles VII was crowned king in Reims Cathedral.
May the messenger of God and men make you the messenger of the clergy and the people.
The French now had a king, but the English refused to give up. On May the 24th, 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by John of Luxembourg, a supporter of Philip the Good.
Vile traitor.
Take her away.
No! Let me go!
John of Luxembourg sold her to the English for £10,000. England accused Joan of heresy and demanded that she be tried by the Church. For 3 months, Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, tried to make Joan confess that she was an envoy, not of God, but of the devil.
When did you hear voices for the first time?
While guarding the animals, I heard a voice. It said to me, God took pity on the people of France. The voice said, Joan, you must go to France. The voice told me to raise the siege of Orléans.
If the court could prove that Joan was an ally of Satan, the legitimacy of Charles VII would be overturned, and Henry VI would take the crown of France.
What was the voice like?
It was a very noble voice. And I knew that it was sent to me by God.
What proof do you have that these revelations were sent to you by God?
All you have to do is believe me.
This woman is a heretic. She must perish in the flames.
On the morning of May the 30th, 1431, after a 55-day trial, Joan was taken to the stake in the marketplace at Rouen. Charles VII did nothing to save the life of the woman who had helped him win the crown of France. With Joan of Arc dead, the King of England, 10-year-old Henry VI, came to Paris to be crowned. But Paris was not Reims. And all kings of France must be crowned in Reims. But the city was held by the Armagnacs. Everybody considered Charles VII to be the only king of France. But Charles's subjects were dying of starvation. War and a bad harvest were ruining the country. For the sake of the people, Armagnacs, English, and the Burgundians agreed to come together to find a solution. But in August 1435 at Arras, the English, fearing they were losing their claim to the French throne, walked away from the negotiating table.
I'll sign it.
Philip of Burgundy withdrew his support for the King of England and switched sides.
I will not back down.
On September the 21st, he alone signed the Treaty of Arras with a representative of the King of France. After 28 years of bitter struggle, Armagnacs and Burgundians finally agreed to make their peace and to recognize Charles VII as the one true king of France. In London, when the news arrived at Westminster, King Henry VI was devastated. he knew the crown of France was lost. In April 1436, the English were driven out of the capital. After 15 years of occupation, Paris was finally back in French hands. In 1449, they launched an attack on Normandy. Within a few months, all the territories taken by the English were recovered by the French army, all except for Aquitaine. It was exactly in the place where the war started nearly 100 years earlier that the final chapter would be written. Charles VII was determined to drive the English out of France once and for all. On June the 30th, 1451, he retook Bordeaux, but the city had been English for 300 years, and the inhabitants didn't want to be ruled by the French. King Henry VI sent one of his best warlords, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. With a relatively small army, he retook Bordeaux 16 months later. Charles VII prepared to retaliate. For the campaign, the King of France employed a new weapon, the bombard, an early cannon firing large-caliber stone or metal balls. In July 1453, with 10,000 men, Charles VII was ready to retake Aquitaine, starting by surrounding Castillon. 3 days later, on the morning of July the 17th, without waiting for his foot soldiers and artillery to arrive, Talbot launched the attack. The French immediately fired on the English,
Fire!
destroying them. On the fringes of the battle, Talbot was unseated and slaughtered. That day, 4,000 English soldiers lost their lives at Castillon after just 1 hour of combat. October the 19th, 1453, Bordeaux was retaken. Aquitaine was once again French. The war that had started 107 years earlier ended. France was at last united, but one question remained. The English still held the vitally important strategic port of Calais. So was the 100 Years' War really over?